Okay, can you also, well, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so I just wanted to put this up to show you what the structure of my talk is going to be this evening over the next 20 minutes. So my talk will be in 5 parts. First is the old is dying. Second is neoliberalism no longer works. The third is revolt from above, revolt from below. The fourth is a crisis of capitalism. And the fifth is will the new be born? So I'm afraid I'm going to have to take this down and unshare it, as it were, because my printer didn't work. I'm going to have to look at my notes on screen. So, but I'll say each subhead as I get to it, as it were. There are a few references which I can stick up again at the end of the talk if anybody is interested. So I'm trying to, yeah, I don't know how to do this. I'm trying to unshare this. Oliver, do you know how I do this? Because otherwise you're going to see my extremely scrappy notes and I'll be embarrassed.
We don't want to see those, Nick. I think
sorry, go on.
Onto the shared screen, there should be a green thing at the top and it says unshare. Yeah, that's good. That's back to you now.
Ah, okay. Now you can, yeah, okay. So can you can no longer see my notes, is that right? Yeah. Okay, you can just see me now.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, not that that's good, but anyway. Okay, so capitalism today and the prospects for socialist freedom. So the first subhead is entitled "The Old is Dying." People may recognize this from Antonio Gramsci, who talked about a certain point that he was writing about. He described it as an interregnum. And he said, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. Now, this has been used quite a lot by analysts of the current period. I think probably, well, the way I've come across it the most successfully is in Nancy Fraser's book of that very title, The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born. And I'll quote from her in a minute, but it's a wonderful little book. And if you haven't read it, I would strongly suggest that you do. I'm arguing then that we are in a very particular period. There's nothing particularly original about that assertion, but I'm going to try and define that a little bit more. So firstly, I'd like to suggest that we've moved on. So the old is dying. We've moved on both from the period of post-war consensus, which actually a lot of analysts sort of almost take for granted we're still somehow or other in. Anyway, I don't anymore. But also I'm arguing that we've moved on from what I've suggested we call the era of post 1989 triumphalism. In other words, when Fukuyama and others suggested that capitalism combined with liberal democracy had really won the day, and that was all we needed to know. I don't think we're there anymore. So very briefly then, in many countries across the globe, substantial changes have been taking place in both party politics, economic policy, economics, grassroots social and political movements. Liberal values are being challenged, and very often, sadly, from my point of view and from many others, of course, the challenge to this particular order, to the old order, is coming from right-wing, often right-wing nationalist parties and movements, and where they've been successful, They're usually led by maverick, charismatic, supposedly individuals who disrupt the status quo or seek to disrupt it. The most obvious example probably is Donald Trump. I don't think Trumpism is dead either. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdogan in Turkey, Orbán in Hungary. We could go on, but I won't. Just briefly, much of the ideology, I would argue anyway, underpinning the Johnson government in Britain and also the Brexit movement more generally, is informed by right-wing nationalism. Certainly quite a lot of, a number of the current cabinet members in the UK are fans of, sorry, the name has just jumped out of my head, Ayn Rand, the right-wing American philosopher. In other countries, the extreme right in a very explicit way has been gaining ground for quite a long time, including France, Germany, and Austria. There have, however, been significant challenges to the status quo or to the established order from the left, very often what I would describe anyway as left social democracy. And this includes the Bernie Sanders movement in the USA, the election of Jeremy Corbyn twice as leader of the Labour Party in Britain, the emergence of Syriza in rather an earlier guise than it is under now in Greece, and the rise of Podemos, again in a slightly different guise, in Spain. Not forgetting La France insoumise in France, of course. At the grassroots, there have been movements like Occupy, the Me Too movement. I'm not sure how grassroots that is, but there were grassroots elements, let's put it like that. And of course, Black Lives Matter, the Indignados movement in Spain. And actually the Gilets jaunes in France, interestingly, spanned both left and right and were certainly a force of revolt. The challenge to the established order then is probably more profound than any time since 1945. And Nancy Fraser suggests the following, open quote, "It is as if masses of people throughout the world had stopped believing in the reigning common sense that has underpinned political domination for the last several decades. It is as if they had lost confidence in the bona fides of the elites and were searching for a new ideology, organizations, and leadership. Given the scale of the breakdown, it's unlikely that this is a coincidence. Let us assume accordingly that we face a global political crisis," end of quote. And that was from Fraser, The Oldest Dying, The New Cannot Be Born. So I would perhaps, just add to that there is no longer widespread conformity, if you like, which is more or less what Nancy Fraser is saying, of course. And the liberal democratic, broadly speaking, this is in advanced industrialized countries, of course, which I'm concentrating on at the moment. The liberal democratic hegemony has broken down. What Max Weber describes as routine consent has also broken down. Weber is not very often, I don't think, quoted in relation to this, but I think he's actually quite interesting in the way he argues that in order to rule any non-dictatorial regime requires routine consent. And once the routine consent breaks down, it's very risky for the established order, let's put it like that. All this is quite well known, what I've just been saying, what I would say before I go on is that many analysts, including left-leaning post-Marxist analysts, often write and speak as if, as I said, we haven't really broken with the liberal democratic period, as I say, and don't go as far as I do in suggesting there is a very profound crisis of capitalism, which is what I intend to argue as I go on. Perhaps I should just mention in passing that the Financial Times has been calling for a time for a reset of capitalism, and they say this very explicitly. For them, it's a more caring capitalism, an indication that even the FT recognizes that the regime itself is not working. Okay, so second part, neoliberalism no longer works. This is my assertion. So if we know what neoliberalism is, it's allowing the market to rule, shrinking the state, breaking the influence of trade unions, increasing inequality. But also I would suggest strongly that it's that neoliberalism increases poverty in an absolute sense, not just in a relative sense. In other words, the number of people who are impoverished and not just less well off than the elites and the higher quartile or whatever increases. Now, neoliberalism was capital's fix, if you like. It was a capital's attempt to, David Harvey has argued this, capital's attempt well, actually rather to get political, but it was capital's attempt to regain the upper hand over labor and to restore profits after the organized working class became rather strong in the post-war period, and rates of profit began to fall from about the end of the mid to the end of the 1960s. It was also a way, of course, of combating the resurgence of class conflict after 1968. The massive 2008 crash was, in a superficial way anyway, a result of these neoliberal policies. And if you want a very good source on that particular point, Kotz, David Kotz argues that very cogently. But my view is that it was more profound than this, as I said. It was a crisis, in my view, of the financialization of capitalism. And this is a financialization which actually, if you look back over, the past several centuries, this financialization has occurred at each point historically that there has been a decline of the geographical locus of capitalism in its heartland. In other words, when the shift happened from the Viennese state to Holland, there was financialization. Not quite so much actually, but certainly when Holland went into decline in terms of being a capitalist heartland, or the Low Countries, and it was shifting to England, there was a financialization. When the shift took place from England to the USA, sometimes known as the Belle Epoque, there was a financialization. And in each case, there was what we have seen over the past 20, 30 years, a huge shift to the financial sector, massive amounts of money being made by banks and related organizations. Brodel, the French historian, who is famous, of course, for his longue durée look at capitalism and other things, talks about financialization in terms of, quote, a sign of autumn, unquote, in terms of capitalist success. My third subhead then, revolt from above, revolt from below, really just to remind ourselves, or for me to say again, that people in many countries, not just advanced capitalist countries, but in many countries are not prepared, in the same numbers at least, to accept the increasing poverty, the increasing precarity, and so on, which is effectively imposed by very obviously rich elites. And as I said before, it's not just growing inequalities, which, for example, someone like Piketty emphasizes greatly. It's not just growing inequalities between rich and poor, but is also, although that does take place, of course, but also, as I said before, absolute impoverishment. And just over the last week or two, we've heard descriptions in the UK, that's the one I've heard anyway, of children falling upon food bank parcels when they're delivered because they literally have had nothing to eat in the past couple of days, etc., etc. And all this has been made worse, of course, by coronavirus and various governments' response to coronavirus. There are shades of fascism in the revolt from what I'm calling the revolt from above. Not by no means identical to fascism in the 1930s, not for the moment anyway. But there are, in the way in which many ordinary people were recruited behind these deeply reactionary, to put it mildly, regimes, there is a certain reminiscence. Next subhead then, a crisis of capitalism. Capitalism, very briefly then, I know time is running out, I've just got a few minutes left. Capitalism is then, if we see it as the ownership and control of enterprises by part of the population, the capitalists, who employ wage earners to produce products for the sale in the market with the aim of gaining a profit. Now, all those individual words are important because at the heart of capitalism, if you put all these things together, there emerges very, very quickly a profound contradiction, because competition, which necessarily emerges, means that products get cheaper. Profit is reinvested into productivity to make cheaper goods and services in order to compete and survive on the part of a firm, and the rate of profit tends to fall. This is sort of basic Capital Volume 1. Capitalism can never keep still. Yeah. It has to keep moving because of the contradictions of capitalism. And if I can put it like this, this compulsion to constantly evolve becomes sooner or later a major disadvantage for the capitalist system. And there are periodic crises, as we all know. Moreover, economies, both national and international, have to keep on growing, which eventually means that, quite apart from anything else, as we know, capitalism will sooner, probably rather than later, if something doesn't happen, it will destroy the planet, quite literally. And that actually, I'm not being facetious here, and that, even quasi-destruction is not good for capitalism itself. Loop back to the Financial Times, and actually Mark Carney giving the Reith lectures today saying something similar. Capitalism then is continuously trying to maintain a balance between profitability on the one hand, which it has to do, but it also has to remain legitimate in the eyes of ordinary people. And this is not, this is actually rather a difficult balancing act. Capitalism then constantly has looked for new fixes, what Alieta has called a regime of accumulation linked to technology, and others have called them slightly different things. For a long time, social democracy offered some sort of a respite in this context, but the social democracy will not, I think, be able to do it any longer. Very briefly then, prospects for socialist freedom, in my view. Two very different outcomes are possible. I think they will be quite extreme outcomes in my view. I can't really see a sort of moderate fix coming about. Possibly some sort of version of fascism is a possibility in various countries. The other possibility is what in July in this same context I suggested was human flourishing, i.e. socialist freedom. It will depend on ordinary people, including us, whether that can come about. It would also depend whether there is more generally an agency. The proletariat, of course, the classic agency, according to Marx, is certainly not what it was. In other words, highly coherent and, I'm exaggerating slightly, highly coherent and highly organized. But there are some positive aspects to what is going on. For example, the labor movement is almost by definition far more sexist, racist, and homophobic than it was several decades ago in many countries. And that is actually not only right, it's not only correct, desirable, it's also a strategic advantage, if I can put it like that. Internationalism is much easier to achieve now. I don't want to paint a rosy picture. I don't feel that particularly optimistic. I don't feel particularly pessimistic, I suppose. The demise of the USSR is not altogether a bad thing, because it has removed a major obstacle in terms of arguing that socialism is possible, apart from in a historical sense. I think I need to stop there because my time is up.